Now that we've gotten over all the Docker stuff, let's go ahead and chat about SQL. So, Mark, you had a question?
Yeah, since Postgres is such a stable, long-running software, what kind of things would change between versions? Like I'm assuming SQL is not going to change the language, but
Yep,
like what types of features would they be changing?
cool. So yeah, like what's changing from version to version on Postgres? Super valid question. So the first thing to know about SQL and Postgres are kind of different things. SQL is a standardized language that exists across not just Postgres, but it also applies to SQL Server, Oracle database, IBM DB2, MySQL, MariaDB. There's a bunch of databases that all use SQL, and there's one single standard language. You can kind of think of it like JavaScript, right? JavaScript is a language, but there's different runtimes that run JavaScript. There's Node.js, there's the browser, there's Deno, there's now Bun, there's Rhino, there's JerryScript, right? They're all using JavaScript, which is the name of a written language, but something different is executing them. It is the same thing with SQL and Postgres. The interesting thing about SQL and Postgres and all these different permutations is they all kind of have their own flavor. Despite the fact that SQL is a standardized language, they all take their own different approaches to it, and they all add their own features to it. So a great example of this is we're going to talk about down in quite a few lessons. There's one here called like JSON-B. This is not a part of the SQL spec. This is a Postgres only thing. So that's what changes between versions is they're adding all these cool new features that are specific to Postgres, and they're making refinements and they're trying new things. Like once we get to JSON-B, you're going to see like why wasn't I teaching this the entire time? Kind of spoiler alerts right there. But that's what's changing is they're adding new cool features, and they're still innovating at a pretty rapid pace. And particularly Postgres I feel like is leading the pack, which is why I chose to teach this one over MySQL mostly. So now is as good a time as any to address the SQL SQL elephant in the room. What is the correct pronunciation of SQL? Well, it depends on who you ask. I did a decent amount of research of this because I was positive that someone was going to ask me. The correct pronunciation of SQL, according to the body that defines SQL, is SQL. They pronounce it SQL. However, the people that make SQL Server, aka Microsoft, calls it SQL Server, right? One of the most well-known people that works on defining what SQL is and writes all these books about it, she calls it SQL. So in other words, SQL is probably, by the most definition of that, the defining body calls it SQL is probably the most correct, but SQL is equally valid. I call it SQL because that's just what I've always called it. There are other people that will always call it SQL. But I think generally my rule of thumb is if I'm talking about MySQL or Postgres or one of those, I generally say SQL. And if I'm talking specifically about SQL Server and Microsoft Stack, I will call it SQL because that's what everyone in that community calls it. Basically, Microsoft and Oracle have codified SQL. So if you're talking about Oracle as well, they call it SQL in their docs. Basically, everyone else that I'm aware of calls it SQL in terms of like it's PostgreSQL, MySQL, MariaDB calls it SQL. So they're both correct. Someone will get really opinionated about it, and you can just tell them that you don't care because it does not matter. We're both talking about the same thing. There's a really interesting history about it, but suffice to say that SQL was invented in the 70s. It was derived from a language called Square. They tried to call it actually literally SQL, SEQUEL. That was some acronym. That was the name of some fighter jet or something like that, so they couldn't call it that, so they ended up calling it Structured Query Language, SQL, and we ended up with that. A fun fact is that my dad actually used to work on SQL databases. He worked on DB2, which is the IBM flavor of it. They still sell DB2 these days. And then he ended up being a technical salesman for IBM for years and years and years. So this is actually stuff I ended up growing up around, kind of unintentionally. It's really funny to my dad that he did all this stuff for all these years, and now I'm teaching it to people. So, fun fact. Hi, Dad. He might be watching. I don't know. Let's get into structured query language, SQL. And again, you can call whatever you want. I will never correct you because I profoundly do not care how you pronounce it. And it's one of those things, those hills that people choose to die on for no apparent reason. So we are going to get started on tables, not inserts. So if you're not already, please get to running inside of your container. You should see something here like Postgres, like that. If not, you can go back to the previous lesson. It will show you how to do that. And let's start running some commands. So again, we are interacting with the Postgres database with a client called PSQL. Those are different things, right? One is a database, one is a client that is sending queries and getting information back. So I could be hosting one database and everybody else could be querying it with their own PSQLs, right? So you have one database, but you could have many clients to it. This client has a bunch of built-in kind of helpful commands, and if you forget what they are, you can hit \\. And this will just pop up a really helpful sort of help information that'll show you a bunch of stuff. I use it all the time because I can never remember all of them. But there's a bunch of stuff here. You can run commands out here. So if I do \, that'll allow me to run a bash command and the underlying bash. Sometimes that can be helpful. You can like cat in files and things like that. We're not going to be using that today, but there's a bunch of stuff you can do with it. And anything that you see prefixed with a \, that's going to be a feature specifically of PSQL and not necessarily of Postgres, the database. The one that I find myself using a lot is \l. This will show me all of the databases that exist. And I'll use \d quite a bit. We haven't created any tables yet, so it will not find any. But \d will show you all of the tables and sequences and constraints and stuff like that. So that's a good place to get started from there. So we have a bunch of default databases. You can see here I have Postgres, I have template 0, and I have template 1. So the first thing to say is, what is a database? Aren't we connected to a database? It's a bit of a conflated term. In this particular context, when I say we're connected to the Postgres database, it means I have my Postgres server running, and there are multiple databases inside of this. You can think of a database in this context as a folder, right? It's a folder that contains many tables, right? Which you can kind of think of like spreadsheets, right? So Postgres here, or template 0, template 1 would be the name of my folder that I'm in. In a moment, we're going to create our own database or create our own folder, but a database contains many other tables and things like that. Okay. As you can see here, your database comes with 3 of them pre-created. So the Postgres one exists solely as the purpose, as it's the default database that you connect to. If you don't give it anything that is like you're trying to connect to a specific database, it just exists for that purpose. It's the default one. You can technically delete it. There's no reason that you can't delete it. You also don't have to. That's up to you. So template 1 and template 0 exist for the fact if you are creating and deleting a bunch of databases and you want to have like a template to start from, you would use template 1. You would make a bunch of modifications to template 1, and that'll affect the default database that you create. If that gets all out of whack, what you'll do is that you'll then clone a new template 1 from template 0. You should never modify template 0. And this is basically all stuff that you can totally forget because I never use them. This is why they're there. This is why they exist. But I never use the templates. I always just create everything from scratch because I don't find myself creating and deleting a lot of databases, right? I generally just create my database and then just go from there, right? But I wanted to know why they're there. Okay, that being said, we are going to run this command, right? So I'm going to say create database recipe guru. So a couple of things to note here. Now I can say \L, and you can see here we have our recipe guru database. So we've created our own folder to work from. We're going to be doing, the first part of this workshop, we're going to be creating a recipe website. Okay? Hence the name Recipe Guru. Now you might have seen there that I said in all caps here, create database like that. Why did I do it that way? Why is it all caps? Well, the reason why I do that is so that you can see the commands that are coming from SQL are always going to be in all caps when I do them for you, and everything that we do that's like optional user-controlled information, that's going to be in lowercase here, like Recipe Guru. That's a very common pattern in SQL, but there are also people that insist that you should never do caps, and it's really dumb, and people are wasting their time and pinky strength by holding shift down for so long. And again, it doesn't matter. I like it. Whenever I'm writing code, I tend to do everything in all caps, so it's really easy for me to glance at and say, like, okay, create database, that's a command, Recipe Guru, that's the name of the database, and it's really easy to parse that visually. But there's no requirement that you have to do that way. I will find myself when I'm just writing queries just to like write queries, I'll probably not do caps just because I'm lazy, right? So that is totally up to you, and it's one of those things like SQL versus SQL, it really just doesn't matter. So it's never worth getting into an argument with anyone over it. So I'm just going to throw out here one more note that if you kill your container at this point and you restart the container, you will have to recreate Recipe Guru again because it's going to give you another blank slate, right? That's just another word of caution that I'm putting out there. I do provide here this complete SQL file. You can actually download this. This will actually be the complete Recipe Guru. So this will give you actually the first half of the workshop already done, if you need that. Or you can use the container from Docker Hub, which is the this one here, the complete intro to SQL. And that will also give you the complete Recipe Guru database. So a database is a collection of similar tables. For all of our recipe apps, we'll be storing them in one database. People ask me frequently, when do I use multiple databases? When do I just shove everything into one database? That is a very you call to make. In general, I tend to shove a lot of things into the same database because I don't really see the use in trying to, make them work across databases. In particular, if anything would ever have to be like related to something else, like I have my ingredients, I have my recipes, those obviously have to be connected to each other, right? Those have to be in the same database, no matter what. But let's say I have like user session information and I have recipes and ingredients. In theory, those could live in different databases because I would never have to like collate those two together, right? So it's a highly opinionated thing, right? It's kind of like asking the question, should I have two services or should I have one monolithic service, right? Should I have microservices or macro services? It depends on what you're doing. For your purposes, getting started, just throw everything in a database and in general you'll be fine. The question you can kind of ask yourself is, would I ever have to scale these things independently? Which is where it can be useful to be split across databases. So you can see here I created the Recipe Guru database, but I am still connected to the Postgres database. So I want to switch my connection. So I'm going to hit \C recipe, and then this actually does have tab completion. So I can hit \C Recipe Guru, and now you can see here I'm connected to the Recipe Guru database, which again has nothing in it. If you put \D, you will not find any relations yet. But we're going to go on to the next lesson. We'll actually create some tables.